Tiffany Nishia de Betlishan Nishlin, Natlana Bashish Chin, Senjakina Dasha Chedo, Natlana Dashanala, Tonsila de Nasha. My name is Tiffany Lee. I am a Distinguished Professor of Native American Studies.
So can you talk about your cultural background and where you came from?
Sure. So, so I'm Navajo and Lakota. I grew up mostly with my Navajo side of my family in New Mexico and Arizona. um, so I grew up with lots of aunts and uncles, lots of cousins and cousin sisters, cousin brothers. We usually refer to them in that way. Went to school on and off the Navajo reservation, but most of my secondary school experience was all on the Navajo Nation. Graduated from there and went to college in California. So, I'll say it again. I'm Black Sheep. My clan is Black Sheep on my mother's side, and it's and Lakota from Pine Ridge, South Dakota on my dad's side.
Can you talk a little bit about, well, let's just ask this question. How long have you been here at the university?
I've been at UNM since 2001, and I actually started in a staff position. I graduated with my PhD in 1999 from Stanford, and we wanted to move back to New Mexico. So I wasn't ready just to go anywhere in the country, which is kind of the path that a lot of academics take, but we wanted to come back to home, be closer to family. So the job I found was going back to teaching high school at Santa Fe Indian School in an amazing program called the Community-Based Education Model, which really kind of inspired and influenced a lot of my later work even till today. And then I found a position at UNM to coordinate a summer bridge program for Native American students to get college experience, but also prepare them for life in serving tribal communities. And from there, I found a postdoc fellowship, which allowed me to choose where I wanted to do the postdoc research. And so I chose Native American Studies at UNM. And it was just kind of like the stars aligned because I was able, at the time, they were a very, very small department, no tenure track faculty. It wasn't even, it was a program. And they were trying to build. So they had just hired 2 affiliated faculty, and maybe a couple of years later, a couple of years into my postdoc, they were able to hire a tenure track position, and that's the position I was able to get, and just kept going from there.
Well, you did mention, community engagement and some of the work that, was established early on in your career. Can you talk about how you moved into community engagement and maybe some of the work that you do today?
Yeah, I think my family, my mother was really my primary example for that. I think the work that they did, a lot of my aunts, my mother was in Indigenous education, or she worked for the Bureau of Indian Education. She was a teacher. It was always by doing work in service to her people. So she was always working on behalf of her own community or other tribal communities. Seeing that with my other, aunts and uncles as well, I think that was a big influence for me. Also, I went to a school, a really special school called the Rock Point Community School when I was in middle school. And that was a unique school that really prioritized Navajo language. At the time, the students, that was their first language. So that was the first language that they were taught in. And they didn't learn, standard English until, maybe second or third grade. So it was really centering Navajo or Diné language and values, and really, in that way, responsive to the community. So I think that's where it all began, those kinds of influences for me. And then, of course, when I went to college, seeing sort of, I came out of school from the Navajo Nation. Majority, obviously, of Navajo students went to this small liberal arts college in Southern California, mostly white students, and who had very, I don't know if they all had privileged backgrounds, but they all came from, schools that were, I guess, privileged in that way. It was a very selective college, so they had to do well in school to get there. And I found that there was such it kind of was shocking to me that there was such an ignorance about Native American people, and it was really what they knew was really rooted in stereotypes and what they would see in media, I guess. And so that kind of also inspired me to want to change that and go into the role of it, into a career in education. But I wanted to do it in a way that would serve my own people also. So went back to teach on the Navajo reservation again. And I think when I was in college, I think something that I learned also was about the history of settler colonialism and colonization across the U.S. and across the world, and how that impacted Native people in many similar ways. And so that was an awakening for me. It was really inspired a critical consciousness. So I wanted to do that have that kind of facilitative role for students back home where I was from. So that's when I returned and was prepared myself to be a high school secondary social studies teacher.
Can you speak a little bit about your role in academia? You've served as chair of Native American Studies, and can you speak a little bit about what is the Department of Native American Studies, and what is potentially the focus of that program?
Yeah, so Native Studies is actually one of the it began in 1970 here at UNM, but didn't become a department until 2018. We actually offered a bachelor's degree in 2004, but and have grown since then. And we now have a master's degree and a PhD. And really the mission of our department is teaching research and service with Native communities, or serving the interests or needs of Native communities. I think a lot of what I learned in college and in graduate school was this history of research that was very negative and very extractive for taking knowledge out of communities, and the professors or the researchers gained from that, but the communities didn't. So I think our department really wanted to change that kind of approach. So doing community-based scholarship and teaching and service is really embedded in our mission. All of our courses, they have even at the undergrad level, have a strong research focus, and we center it in what we call Indigenous-based methodologies, which are really rooted in protocols, or how you work with a Native community in respectful ways, responsive ways that aren't going to be extractive, that aren't going to harm those communities, but in fact benefit them, or do research in collaboration with them as well.
Well, I know you've done a lot of research around Indigenous language. Can you speak a little bit about that work, and how do you set up your community-based work with different communities?
Yeah, so I think earlier on in my career, I did a lot of work with Native youth, particularly Navajo youth, but being in the Southwest, a lot of other Pueblo and Apache youth as well, and other communities that live in this area, youth that live in this area, wanting to understand how language learning could be improved, so that having fluency in your language, or being able to speak one's language, is really important for a lot of our communities, and it's really important for our youth. That's one of the things I've really learned in working with a lot of Native youth. But it's having the access or opportunity to learn today, as things have changed, as we're trying to get over a system that really tried to do away with our languages. And there's a lot of internalization of that kind of feeling of that there's a sense of maybe a feeling that our languages are inferior, or going to hold us back. So we have a lot of healing to do from that. So I think that interested me. My experience at the school at Rock Point, knowing that my mother's first language was Navajo, and I remember being in a car with her when I was 9 years old, and she had a lot of regret. She was like, "I wish I had taught you Navajo more as you were growing up." And so those kinds of memories and experiences, I think, really influenced me to pursue this area of language education, language revitalization, and sustainability. And I think learning about past research practices with Native people, and wanting to do it in ways that were more meaningful, that were more beneficial, that really has to involve community and learning how to do that in appropriate ways. So I think that's what's led in the research I do now. In language, I now do more research in with Indigenous language immersion schools across the nation and their impact, and now also looking at specifically Navajo language and how learning Navajo impacts one's sense of well-being. So trying to understand that relationship as well, and working with families and communities and schools as partners in that research.
One of the things that we learned about when you spoke at the symposium was about the Spencer Foundation grant.
Mhm.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I work with colleagues at UCLA and University of Arizona on this nationwide study that the Spencer Foundation has funded to determine how Indigenous language immersion schools impact education for Native American learners. So we're looking at what are their opportunities to learn in those kinds of settings and immersion settings, and what are the outcomes. So it's like a mixed methods research where we have a qualitative and quantitative component. We have case studies. We've involved 8 sites across from Hawaii all the way to New York, looking at working with schools that have been established probably for 40 years or more. And they use the language 80 to 100% of the time throughout the day. Everything is in the language. So these children come to school. Primarily, they're coming to school as pre-K or kindergarten, speaking English, and then they're immersed in their native language, and continue in that until the immersion school. Most of these immersion schools go through 5th grade, 8th grade, and only in Hawaii they go all the way up through senior year high school. But it takes so much commitment and so much time and effort and for these schools to have to develop their own curriculum, to train their own teachers, um, to learn how to work with children who are speaking English and come to school, and now all of a sudden they have to learn through their Indigenous language. These are skills that have to be harnessed. You have to learn. You don't typically learn those kinds of skills for teaching in an immersion way in a typical teacher training or teacher education program. So learning about these schools and the impact that they've had on their children, and then even more so when we go to these schools and walk in the school building and all the children are speaking in their native language, it's just so heartwarming and hopeful and inspiring, and it just really makes you want to get more involved, right? And to support these schools, and because that's such a native languages in this country are shifting. A lot of the children in most communities, I'd say today, not all of them, but most of them are speaking English as their first language. While the language is present in a lot of ways, it's not as robust as it had been. So that given that there's such an integral tie of language to culture, to identity, to community, to worldview, philosophy, knowledge, everything, it's really important that we find ways to support, our native languages sustaining and revitalizing where we can. So these schools provide models for that kind of approach and success, because these children speak their native language, fluently.
As an educator, how do you encourage your students and potentially educators in terms of engaging Native communities?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, in American Studies, that's a big part of our mission. So, a lot of our classes really teach about that. How would you go about working with the community from the very beginning steps of thinking about your question that you want to answer, that you want to investigate, to working with the community to to the end of this, to how you share it back and what you do with the knowledge that you've gained. And so I think a lot of since the late 1990s to throughout up till now, there's been a lot more scholarship from Indigenous authors around research and how to do it in ways that are responsive to communities, respectful and appropriate and responsible, and relevant and reciprocal. There's all those R's, and they're really rooted in relationship building relationships with those communities, that you're not a helicopter researcher who comes in, extracts knowledge and leaves and never has anything to do with the community again. But it's really about, if you really want to serve and do research that is impactful and meaningful, then you have to develop a relationship with that partner and learn from them, collaborate with them, and you know but also do your part in the research, as coming in with that kind of skills and knowledge of how to work with that community, and learning that, being very humble, having a lot of humility, I think is important. So we teach methods, but it's really about protocols, and having what's your integrity and what's your intent in doing this research. It's really about the values for it as well. So we do this in our classes in a number of ways, in specific research methods class, but also in a class we call, for example, Indigenous community, what is it called? Community-based education in Indigenous contexts. So we work with partners on projects. So for example, when I taught that class in the past, I had students work with the Lobo Gardens here on campus to help develop the gardening, and the students could learn gardening so that they could then work with other organizations on developing community gardens. And this is something, I don't know a lot about. So I was really learning also along with them about growing, creating community gardens. And then we connect that back in our, the academic side to issues around food sovereignty and food security, and the relationship between food and language and culture. And so I think it's very holistic in that way. It's when you talk about community engagement, it can touch on all the issues and areas that we teach about in Native American studies that are important to our communities as well.
Being an academic and going through the process of tenure and promotion, I think that we have a lot of work to do in terms of acknowledging the impact and the importance of community engagement. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you personally, and potentially as the chair of the department, in terms of valuing this type of work?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I think UNM has grown tremendously in understanding and valuing community engagement. Just having your office, for example, as a university-wide, community engagement office is an important step. But in our department, Native American Studies, and for me personally, and I think for all our faculty as well, we have such high value for that, and trying to understand how to be the best kind of researcher that is community based, and what that means. It doesn't mean just having a community sign on your proposal and then that helps you get the grant, right? It has to be a lot more meaningful. And again, going back to that relationship building. So one of the things that we've done in Native American Studies is try to make policy out of it. So we've integrated community, we call it community-based and community engaged scholarship, teaching, and service into our promotion and tenure guidelines, so that we see equal weight for a community-based report that goes back to a native nation for only for them to use, and it's not going to be published in an academic journal, but it's research that's for that community. We give that equal weight to a peer-reviewed journal article, for example. Or we also elevated service, because a lot of our faculty in this relationship building, in doing community-based or community engaged work, it's often considered service, because you're helping the community in a number of ways, and working with them in a number of ways. Not that integrates your research, it integrates your teaching. So they're all kind of overlapping with each other. So we want to recognize that and acknowledge it, and give credit for that in a way that's more meaningful. So we really look at research, teaching, and service in our P&T guidelines in equal ways, and we spell that out in the dossiers, in the chair's letter, and hope that the next review committees is very apparent that's how we want our faculty to be reviewed. So I think that's a big step, because it helps to make, I guess, provides precedence for departments to, maybe it's a model that other departments can look at, but it also shows that even though the university might have a different way of looking at what counts as knowledge and knowledge production, we're also recognizing and honoring that system, but we're elevating certain elements of it in ways that are in alignment with our own mission and our own values.
Um, in terms of being a leader, being a chair and then serving as president of the American Indian Studies Association, can you talk a little bit about, what that means to you, and also in terms of elevating Native American studies?
Yeah, so I think organizations like the American Indian Studies Association and uh, other similar, organizations that really look at Native American issues help to spread and build awareness about those kinds of values I was referring to before, and that approach at a large scale level, national and international. Because the ASA, the American Indian Studies Association, has a real community feel to it. There's people from all over the country come to this conference, and from other from Mexico and Canada as well. And um, but it's small enough that it has a real community feel, so you can really establish a strong network of people who have a shared values and mission in doing this kind of work. But it also has in that building that network, you can reach out with in their respective universities or communities, you know those kinds of projects that are you can bring awareness to them. And I think that's sharing that knowledge in those ways is really important, in addition to the ways that communities are responsive to that they want you to share. But I think we also, given that we are academics in university settings, we can write books, publish articles, or do presentations that academia can also access and learn from, and so that we can have some influence also on all the researchers out there that want to work with Native communities around Native issues.
What kind of advice would you give students or faculty who want to engage in Native communities in a respectful and impactful way?
Yeah. I think um, first it's really about centering what is your integrity, asking yourself, what is your integrity and what is your intent in doing this research? And then what is this research of value or importance to the Native community that you want to work with? Um, and then, after you kind of have a sense of that, you know, your purpose there. And that would take conversations with that community. It's really about building that relationship first so that you have some trust, established, and you're learning from that community about how you would interact with them, and if, what would be your role, in doing this kind of research, what would be their role, and how will it provide some change. So I think, also for students in Native American studies, when a lot of our students take our classes, um, some of the first times that they've learned, like for me, learned about sort of this impact of settler colonialism across the world on Indigenous people in very critical intellectual ways as well. We see the social impact, the environmental, the health impacts, but when we learn about it more at a policy level, and then it's transformative. I think James Banks has written about it as transformative academic knowledge. It inspires you. It's a critical consciousness. It's you want to do something about it at that point. You want to help to be a part of changing the world and making it a better place. So I think those are great goals, and it inspires you to do this kind of research. But then also then humbling yourself in, okay, but I'm just one person, and how can I do this in relationship with community or with other like-minded folks who have that kind of passion in a way that is that honors that community, that's again going back to those R's, that's respectful and responsible and relevant and reciprocal, and is on the foundation of that relationship.
If you could share one message with the university community about the importance of Indigenous education and community engagement, what would it be?
One message. Wow. I think the message would be that our world, our country, our state, the city can learn a lot from what Native people are doing in Indigenous education, especially those Indigenous language immersion schools, because what they're doing is not just um, having students go through a system, that's, I guess, determined by some outside external organization, like the state, for example, public education department. It's really what they're doing is building community through the language. So that you're teaching content areas that are important for the students to know as they move, throughout school, and important for them to know to be successful and be confident. But they're learning through the language, their connection to who they are, their culture, their community. Um, they have the students that I've seen in these schools are so confident and are so motivated to want to continue with the language, but also to transform their communities as well. And so I think there's a lot to learn from that. Are our school systems doing that now? Our public school systems, are they doing that with our students through the kind of approach that we have? Or is there a way we can adopt, what we've learned from good models, important models, successful models? And even through their challenges, what can we adopt and learn from those schools to improve education for everybody? My name's Tiffany Lee. I am a distinguished professor of Native American Studies.